A single strip of industrial mesh tape vibrated against the shuttle's hull, peeling back like a scab. Beneath the opalescent arches of Ethelgard's main dock, that jagged line of gray was the only blemish in a world of liquid silver and polished crystal. Why the Sol Coalition had sent their champion in a vessel that groaned with every atmospheric shift remained the first, and perhaps most insulting, mystery of the day. The chitinous brood doesn't just kill, they erase the memory of a world. You'll want to see how a man with scuffed boots stood against them. Kalara of the Dawn stood upon the observation terrace, her skin rippling with the iridescent glow of a supernova caught in glass. To her people, the Bond of Worlds ceremony was a soul-staining abomination, a political sacrifice where a divine royal was tethered to a creature of clay and carbon. Her throat tightened, and she instinctively touched the hollow of her neck, a royal gesture of warding against the inevitable. Across the gangplank stepped Captain Elias Thorne, his boots caked in the orange dust of a dozen different battlefields. Unlike the Aurelian honor guard who moved like flowing mercury, Thorne walked with a heavy, rhythmic thud that seemed to bruise the very floors of the palace. Those scuffed boots, the human appeared to wear like a badge of office. He offered no bow, no song of greeting, only a steady, warm smile that Kalara found deeply irritating in its simplicity. "You are the one they sent to formalize the peace," Kalara remarked, her flawless grammar cutting through the humid air of the greeting hall. She looked down from her 7-foot height, searching for any sign of shame in his weathered face. "I expected a diplomat, not a mechanic who forgot to wash his uniform." Thorne didn't answer immediately. Instead, he checked his bare left wrist, a phantom habit of a man who had worn a tactical chronometer for too long, and began a slow, rhythmic tapping against his right thigh. Kalara watched the tick, certain it was a nervous tremor. He looked up at her, that irritating smile widening to reveal teeth that had clearly seen their share of combat rations. "Peace is messy, princess," he said, his voice a blunt instrument compared to her melodic tones. "I figured scuffed boots were more honest than a clean suit." Fool. The formal spar began an hour later in the blood-soaked training arena, a circle of white sand that had tasted the life force of 1,000 failed suitors. Kalara moved like a whip of liquid light, her practice blade connecting with Thorne's ribs, his shoulder, and finally the side of his jaw with a sound like a hammer striking wet leather. Rose from the white sand the sharp scent of ionized air. 7 times the human hit the sand, and 7 times the rhythmic thud of his boots returned to the floor, his breathing ragged but his gaze locked on hers. She could feel the confusion growing in her neural core, a static interference that hissed at her logic. Humans were fragile, prone to shock and muscular failure. Yet he stood there with that same warm provocation on his lips, as if he were enjoying the physical destruction of his own body. Deep within his quarters that night, a shadow detached itself from the ceiling. A glass-fanged SP, its translucent body pulsing with a neurotoxin designed to liquefy a heart in seconds. The creature struck Thorne's forearm while he sat on the edge of his cot, adjusting the laces of his boots. He didn't scream. He didn't even flinch. He simply pinned the snake to the floor with a heavy heel and watched it thrash. Duke Valerius entered a minute later, his silver skin dimming with the expectation of finding a corpse. Instead, he found Thorne casually inspecting the puncture wounds on his arm. "You're late for the body collection, Duke," Thorne said, tossing the dead serpent into a trash bin. "And you might want to check the breeder. This thing's bite tastes like a poorly seasoned taco I had once in a roadside diner back on Earth." The Duke's skin flickered a panicked violet, a biological reaction Thorne seemed to ignore. Kalara watched from the surveillance feed, her understanding of human physiology fracturing. She had seen him bleed, had felt his bones crack under her strikes, and yet he spoke of assassination as if it were a minor culinary disappointment. The warmth in his eyes wasn't ignorance. It was an endurance she hadn't been trained to measure. 3 days of silence followed, a heavy, airless peace that tasted of copper and recycled oxygen. Kalara watched the human from the high terrace as he worked in the palace gardens, his movements slow and deliberate, a sharp contrast to the frantic energy radiating from her own advisors. Beneath the crystalline sun of Ethelgard, Thorn didn't seem like a warrior. He looked like a man trying to remember the weight of a planet he would never see again. Every few minutes, his fingers would brush the pocket over his heart, a rhythmic tapping that Kalara now recognized as more than a nervous tremor. It was a count, a steady calibration of time against a clock only he could hear. The neural core of the Brood flagship coordinates 3 million drones through a single subspace frequency, Duke Valerius stated, his voice a series of sharp clicks as he pointed to the tactual display. Kalara looked at Thorn, who was leaning against a marble pillar with his arms crossed. "You're saying if we take out that ship, the rest of them go brain dead?" Thorn asked. "Through the central neural processor, the entire armada is sustained," Kalara explained, her skin rippling with cold silver. "But its defenses are impenetrable. Our ships cannot get close enough to deploy a payload before the psychic scream liquefies the pilots." Thorn looked at his scuffed boots. "Then don't use an Aurelian pilot. Use a human who doesn't mind a little noise." Into the atmosphere plummeted the first wave of the chitinous brood, their jagged ships tearing through the orbital grid like teeth through silk. To the Aurelians, war was a calculated ballet of laser fire and shields, but this was a flood of primitive hunger. From the debris field rose a psychic scream that made the royal guards collapse, their liquid skin dimming to a dull, sickly gray. Only the human remained standing, his boots planted firmly on the vibrating deck of the command center. Thorn sat on a storage crate and adjusted the laces of his boots. He complained that the left one always felt tighter than the right. Then came the moment that shattered every Aurelian assumption about human limitation. Thorn sprinted toward his battered shuttle, his movements no longer heavy, but possessing a terrifying, focused efficiency. Kalara watched him through the bridge view screen, her fingers touching the hollow of her throat in a silent prayer for the man she had mocked. The smile, she finally understood, wasn't a sign of ignorance or a lack of shame. It was a biological weapon. By maintaining that warm, steady expression, Thorn was forcing his brain to suppress the cortisol that would have otherwise paralyzed him under the brood's psychic pressure. That rhythmic tapping on his leg was the only thing keeping his heart in a human rhythm while the hive mind tried to tear his consciousness apart. Elias Thorn steps from the blackened shuttle wreckage, wiping blood from a steady, warm smile. In the smoking silence of the neural processor's remains, a single piece of paper was recovered from the ash. It was a drawing of a sunflower, the yellow wax lines smeared by the heat of the explosion that had saved 2 worlds. Mina, the name was written in a child's messy script at the bottom. The cost of the ceasefire was no longer a political calculation. It was a promise made to a girl 3 systems away. Gone was the brood's psychic scream. Kalara stood amidst the cooling slag of the hangar bay. The hive ship above continued its silent orbit, steel and shadow against an empty sky. Within the twisted metal of the cockpit, a scuffed boot rested against the throttle. A single, warm smile reflected in the cracked glass of the monitor.